Something fundamental just broke in the way this world is run, and most Americans haven't been told the full story yet. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a war on Iran. The US and Israel struck over 5,000 targets since that war began: nuclear facilities, oil refineries, a desalination plant, civilian infrastructure. And then, in the middle of all of that destruction, something happened that Washington did not plan for. Iran appointed a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man the US helped kill, and his appointment signals a clear willingness to continue the war. Trump called him a lightweight and warned the new leader would not last long without his approval. That is not diplomacy. That is a threat. And here is where the story shifts into something far bigger than most headlines are willing to say out loud. Putin offered his unwavering support to Iran's new Ayatollah, and China's foreign ministry made clear that Beijing stands firmly behind Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. Two of the most powerful nations on earth, nations holding veto power at the United Nations, nations controlling vast energy supplies, nuclear arsenals, and entire trade corridors, have now publicly drawn a line. Meanwhile, Putin told Russian energy companies to take advantage of the global market disruption and warned that oil production dependent on the Strait of Hormuz could soon grind to a halt, a strait that has effectively been shut down since this war began. Oil crossed $110 a barrel. Global financial markets are reeling, and the American people are being told this will all be over very soon. What you are watching is not just a Middle East war, it is a contest over who gets to define the rules of this world, and whether those rules still belong to Washington alone. Now let's think carefully about what actually happened here, because the facts themselves tell a story that no spin from Washington can erase. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched nearly 900 strikes in just 12 hours, targeting missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and the leadership of Iran all at once. The opening salvo killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of other officials, but it also killed more than 160 people when a missile struck a girls' school adjacent to a naval base in the south. That was day one. And the American people were told it was surgical, they were told it was precise, they were told it was about nuclear weapons. But when you strip away the language of press releases and look at what actually happened on the ground, you see strikes on schools, hospitals, the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, the Golestan Palace, civilian infrastructure that has no relationship to a nuclear program. That is not a nuclear deterrence mission. That is something else entirely. Now, I want you to understand how we got here, because this war did not begin on February 28th. It began much earlier, quietly, in the logic of a foreign policy that decided regime change in Iran was not just possible, it was inevitable. The attacks came when the Iranian regime was, by most measurements, at its weakest point in years. There had been extensive protests in Iran in early 2026, motivated by a weakened economy and struggling infrastructure, protests that were put down with extensive force. And prior to all of that, a 12-day conflict in June 2025 had been the first open test of military confrontation between the US, Israel, and Iran. Israel severely damaged Iran's air defenses and caused significant damage to its military and nuclear infrastructure. That conflict ended after the United States struck underground nuclear facilities using bunker buster bombs in what Trump described as a limited one-off mission. Except nothing about this was ever going to be a one-off, because when a government decides it wants regime change, no single strike is ever the last one. And then came the economic warfare. After that 2025 conflict, Iran's currency entered a free fall, exacerbated by new international sanctions imposed in September. The economic spiral led to protests on December 28, 2025, which, at the encouragement of the United States, spread across Iran in January 2026. Trump threatened US intervention if Iranian security forces killed protesters. Nevertheless, on January 8th, security forces unleashed a brutal crackdown, killing at least 30,000 people, according to officials in Iran's Ministry of Health. 30,000 people, and barely a whisper about it in the mainstream coverage of this war. Because once you understand that 30,000 Iranians were killed by their own government, while that same government was being destabilized by US-backed pressure, the moral clarity that Washington was trying to project becomes considerably more complicated. So by the time February 28th arrived, the stage had been set for months. The protests had failed, the sanctions had squeezed but not collapsed, and someone in Washington decided the time had come to go all the way. The United States and Israel launched the assault with the stated aim of toppling the regime in Tehran. Trump said the operation would seek to eliminate Iran's nuclear and missile programs, destroy the country's navy, and change its leadership. Change its leadership. Think about what that means. A sitting American president declared publicly that the goal of a military operation was to choose who runs another country. And the people cheering in the streets of Washington called it freedom. Now, here is where the story shifts in a direction that most American news networks are struggling to explain clearly, because Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran struck back, and it struck back at everything. Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone strikes targeting US embassies and military installations in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan. Iranian attacks also targeted oil infrastructure in the region, including vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes, as well as commercial hubs with the intent of exacting costs on neighboring countries that aid the US military. The Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile-wide passage between Iran and Oman, became the most consequential piece of geography on the planet almost overnight. And what happened to the strait matters enormously, not just as a military fact, but as an economic fact that hits every single American family directly. The effective halt in shipping traffic through the strait disrupted about 20% of the world's daily oil supply and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. Tanker traffic dropped by approximately 70%, with over 150 ships anchoring outside the strait to avoid risks, and then traffic fell to near zero. The conflict caused Brent crude oil prices to rise from around $70 to over $110 per barrel within days, and gasoline prices in the United States rose sharply, with analysts warning this could wipe out months of inflation progress and push the Federal Reserve into a corner where it cannot cut interest rates without feeding an inflation spiral. That is not an abstract geopolitical consequence. That is a number your family sees every time you pull up to a gas station. That is the price you pay for wars sold to you as somebody else's problem. Now, let us talk about Russia, because this is where the most important and least discussed part of this entire story lives. While the bombs were still falling on Tehran, while the fires at Iranian oil refineries were still burning bright enough to be seen from satellites, reports emerged that Russia was providing Iran with intelligence for its targets, confirmed by US sources speaking on condition of anonymity. It was the first indication that another adversary of the US could be indirectly helping Iran in the war. Think about what that means in practice. Russia, which signed a strategic partnership agreement with Iran in 2025, was reportedly feeding coordinates and targeting intelligence to a country under active American bombardment. This is not a cold relationship between distant allies. This is an operational partnership being stress tested in real time. And then when Iran named its new supreme leader, Putin formally pledged unwavering support to Mojtaba Khamenei, characterizing the transition as occurring during a period of armed aggression against Iran and reaffirming that Russia has been and will remain a reliable partner. Putin did not hedge. He did not offer a measured diplomatic statement of cautious support. He used the word unwavering, and he did this openly, on the record, published by the Kremlin on Telegram, while a sitting American president was publicly threatening to kill Iran's new leader. These two things, Trump's threat and Putin's pledge, happened essentially simultaneously. That is not a coincidence. That is a message. China's foreign ministry spokesman told reporters that Iran's decision to appoint the younger Khamenei was based on its constitution and that China opposes interference in other countries' internal affairs under any pretext, and that Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity should be respected. Read that again slowly. China, the second largest economy on earth, the country that holds more US debt than almost any other nation, the country upon which American supply chains depend for everything from electronics to medicine. China publicly and formally told the United States not to kill Iran's new leader. That is not background noise. That is a direct statement of position from a great power to another great power. And it was delivered calmly through official channels without dramatics, which is often the most serious kind of warning. Now, I want to be honest with you about something because you deserve more than cheerleading in either direction. Putin, while pledging support, was also reportedly engaged in high-stakes strategic hedging. On Monday, he held a one-hour phone call with President Donald Trump. So Putin is simultaneously pledging unwavering support to Iran's new supreme leader and talking on the phone with the man who killed the last one. That tells you everything you need to know about the complexity of this moment. Nobody is purely ideological here. Everyone is calculating. Putin is not acting out of love for the Iranian theocracy. He is acting because this conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets, with India and China both facing strong incentives to deepen reliance on Russian supply as Middle East barrels face logistical disruption. Every day, the Strait of Hormuz stays effectively closed. Every day, oil prices stay elevated, Russia profits. It is as simple and as cold as that. And China's calculus is no less self-interested. Roughly 40 to 45% of China's imported oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. A prolonged closure does not help China either. It strains Chinese industrial output and energy security in ways that Beijing cannot absorb indefinitely. So when China speaks about Iran's sovereignty, it is speaking partly from principle and partly from the practical reality that the disruption of energy flows through that narrow waterway is an economic crisis for Beijing as much as for anyone else. Understanding that China's defense of Iran is also a defense of China's own energy supply does not make the defense less real. It makes it more sustainable because it is grounded in durable national interest rather than passing sentiment. Now let us come to the new supreme leader himself, because the selection of Mojtaba Khamenei is one of the most important and underanalyzed events of this entire war. For most of his 56 years, Mojtaba Khamenei kept a low profile in the Islamic Republic, quietly building networks of influence in the country's security apparatus, its clergy, and within its wealthy business elite. As he steps into his father's shoes, he faces not only a US and Israeli war machine bent on his downfall, but a population in turmoil, much of which is desperate to see the back of his regime. That last part is crucial and almost never gets said plainly in American coverage. The Iranian people who were protesting in the streets just 2 months ago, who were being killed by their own government for demanding basic dignity, those same people are now watching American bombs fall on their cities, and the history of how people respond to foreign bombardment of their homeland is not ambiguous. They rally, they unify, they survive, and they remember. The IRGC pressured the Assembly of Experts to elect Mojtaba Khamenei with IRGC commanders making repeated contacts and applying psychological and political pressure. Members described the atmosphere of the meeting as unnatural. Those who presented arguments against Mojtaba Khamenei were given limited time to speak. Discussion was cut off and a vote was held. So even within the Iranian system, this was not a clean democratic transition. It was a military apparatus forcing through its preferred candidate in the middle of a war, which tells you something about who actually holds power in Iran right now. It is not the clerics, it is the Revolutionary Guard. And the Revolutionary Guard has every reason to keep fighting because this war is their justification for existing. You do not negotiate when you are the institution that becomes more powerful the longer the war continues. Trump had previously insisted he should have a say in appointing a new Iranian leader, which Tehran flatly rejected. Trump told NBC News he thought Iran made a big mistake. Israel's military had already threatened to kill any replacement for Khamenei. Senator Lindsey Graham wrote on X that it was just a matter of time before the new supreme leader meets the same fate as his father. Let us be clear about what this means in terms of international law and the norms that the United States spent decades insisting the rest of the world follow. The United States is publicly threatening to assassinate a foreign head of state it disapproves of because that head of state did not seek American approval before taking office in his own country. And members of the United States Senate are publicly predicting and implicitly endorsing that assassination. This is not foreign policy. This is something that, if any other country said it about an American leader, would be treated as an act of war. A US National Intelligence Council report found that a large-scale US-led assault on Iran was unlikely to topple the country's government, and described the prospect of Iran's fragmented opposition taking control of the country as unlikely. The US government's own intelligence, its own analysts, paid by taxpayers to tell the truth about what is possible, concluded that this war will probably not achieve its stated objectives. The regime will not fall. The opposition cannot fill the vacuum. And yet the war continues. When a government pursues a policy that its own intelligence community has assessed as unlikely to succeed, the question you have to ask is not what the stated goal is. The question is what the unstated goal is. And that question, honestly and seriously asked, is one that American citizens deserve to have answered. The conflict disrupted approximately 20% of global oil supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz, causing Brent crude to rise from around $70 to over $110 per barrel within days. Analysts projected potential global inflation increases and risks of recession if disruptions persisted. South Korea, which imports 20% of its gas from the region, said it could run out of LNG in 9 days. European natural gas prices nearly doubled. The disruption is not contained to the Middle East. It is not contained to the countries directly involved in the fighting. It is a global economic event, one that will show up in your grocery bill, your heating costs, your mortgage rate, and the employment numbers that politicians will argue about for the next 2 years. Israel's Army Chief of Staff said Israel had destroyed 80% of Iran's air defenses and at least 60% of its ability to launch missiles. And yet Iran is still firing, still striking US bases, still launching drones across the Gulf. A senior official in the Israeli military's operations directorate told NPR that Israel needs 3 more weeks to accomplish its goal of wiping out Iran's military forces, but that Israel is fighting as if every day of the war could be the last. 3 more weeks. That is what was being said on day 9 of a war that was supposed to be swift and decisive. 3 more weeks after already destroying 80% of Iran's air defenses, after already conducting thousands of strikes, after already killing the supreme leader. 3 more weeks tells you that the original timeline was wrong, that the original assumptions were wrong, and that the cost in lives, in dollars, in global stability is going to be higher than any American was told before any of this began. What you are witnessing right now is a confrontation between two different visions of how the world should work. One vision says that American military and diplomatic dominance is the organizing principle of global order, that Washington sets the rules and everyone else either follows them or suffers the consequences. The other vision, the one that Putin and Xi are articulating imperfectly and self interestedly as they do, says that no single country gets to determine who leads another country, that sovereignty means something real, that the rules apply to everyone or they apply to no one. Now, you may have strong feelings about who is right. You may believe deeply in American leadership, or you may be skeptical of it. But whatever you believe, you need to understand that the second vision has now been endorsed publicly and simultaneously by the two countries with the largest nuclear arsenals outside the United States. That is not a detail. That is the architecture of what comes next. Iran announced it would allow only Chinese vessels to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, citing China's supportive stance toward Iran since the conflict intensified. Read that sentence again. Iran, in the middle of a war with the United States, is selectively reopening its blocked waterway for Chinese ships. This is not just a military or economic gesture. It is a declaration of alignment. It is Iran saying, in the most direct way possible, that China is a partner and the United States is an enemy. And it is China, by accepting those passages, implicitly accepting that designation, the world that was imagined after 1991, in which American power was so overwhelming that no serious challenger was conceivable, that world is not being renegotiated. It has already ended. What we are watching right now is the argument about what replaces it. And the American people who are paying for this war with their tax dollars and their gas prices and their inflation and their sons and daughters in uniform across the Gulf region, the American people deserve to know all of this. Not the version that fits into a 2-minute segment between car commercials, not the version where the complexity gets smoothed over and the casualties get minimized and the intelligence failures get buried in footnotes. The full version, the version that includes the 30,000 Iranians killed by their own government before a single American bomb fell, the version that includes the girls' school that was struck on day one, the version that includes the US intelligence community's own assessment that regime change is unlikely, the version that includes Putin's phone call with Trump happening on the same day Putin pledged unwavering support to the man Trump threatened to kill, all of it. Because an informed citizenry making serious judgments about serious things is the only honest foundation for a democracy. And this moment right now demands exactly that.